Thank you so much for joining us today. Our webinar is called What is Mind? My name is Victoria Coleman. I'm the Director of the Foundation for Developing Compassion and Wisdom. I just wanted to share a little bit about what happened to produce this webinar, what our thought process was. So earlier this year, the Foundation developed a course called Discovering the Wisdom of Neuroscience. We asked Ceci Buzon to help us develop that course and to facilitate it. The course proved to be very popular and we ran it twice this year, and we're going to run it next year in February. We decided to organize this webinar and invited Geshe Namdak to join Ceci to offer a Buddhist perspective of what mind is. Geshe Namdak is one of the few Westerners to have completed the rigorous 20-year Geshe program at Sera Monastery, and the first Westerner to complete the Vajrayana study program at Yume Tantric College in India. He originally trained as a hydrology scientist and worked as an environmental researcher before becoming ordained by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He has done many retreats and is an experienced teacher in the practical and philosophical aspects of Buddhism. Currently, Geshe Namdak is the resident teacher at Jamyang Buddhist Centre in London and also teaches at other centres worldwide. Our other speaker is Ceci Buzon, who holds a diploma in neuropsychoeducation from the University of Buenos Aires. In 2015, she received a scholarship from the Greater Good Science Center to study there at the University of California in Berkeley. She's currently studying emotional education for trauma and resiliency at the University of Buenos Aires. She's been a 16 Guidelines facilitator since 2012 and has trained in creating compassionate cultures in France and at Tara Redwood School in California with the program's founder, Pamela Caton. She has delivered courses in Argentina, Chile, France, India, Nepal, and Mongolia, and is a member of the Foundation for Developing Compassion and Wisdom Senior Faculty Committee. Ceci has 23 years teaching experience and has been the head of her own school in Argentina for 17 years. In Patagonia, she held teacher training sessions and retreats on implementing social and emotional learning in the classroom. Our moderator today is Scott Snibbe. I asked Scott to moderate this because I discovered his excellent podcast series called A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment. This series brings the inner science of Buddhist meditation to 21st century people who are hungry for happy, more meaningful lives. It's a secular approach to meditation that requires no belief beyond our current understanding of science and psychology. So there's a lot of crossover between the work that Scott is doing and the Foundation's work. You can find his podcasts on skepticspath.org, and I really enjoyed his latest podcast on how to use pleasure to transform the mind. But enough from me, time is short. I'm now going to hand over to Scott to start the session.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure getting to speak with two wonderful people. One that I'm just meeting, Ceci, and Geshe Namdak, who I've known for a little while. So thanks a lot. We wanted to start a little bit with just introductions from you both to talk about what each of you does in the context of understanding the mind. And because I think Ceci is newer to a lot of the audience watching, I thought we'd begin with her. Ceci, could you talk a little bit about discovering the wisdom of neuroscience, what you teach, who's the audience, and this word neuropsychoeducation? It was brand new to me. So I'm very curious about this new field of education or study.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you to FDCW for inviting me. Thank you, Geshe, for accepting having this dialogue with somebody who we didn't met before. We haven't met before. So what a pleasure to be here learning from you all. Well, you know, many years ago, after being a teacher, a regular school teacher for more than 10 years, I discovered, or I met the 16 Guidelines, the FDCW Foundation, and I started having questions about what I was doing, having questions about how profound could be the teaching I was doing at the moment. Here in Argentina, having a regular school with about 100 children ranging from 3 to 17 years old, and this feeling of, you know, something is missing. This emotional piece to education was missing at that point. And through the foundation, through their courses, I started integrating this into regular classes. But then more questions arose, and that is the part when neuropsychoeducation appeared early in Argentina at the University of Buenos Aires. So there was a diploma offered to teachers at all levels to learn about what the brain is, what the mind is, how they work together, how can we use this knowledge into the classroom. And so the journey began more than 10 years ago. The terminology of neuropsychoeducation is to broaden the idea of educating children. If you come to think about it, I thought, okay, I am working with these children's brains and minds and emotional range without knowing much about how it actually works. What is happening inside their heads that I can use to enhance my teaching, to be a better teacher? So after having the diploma and integrating many activities in the classroom, I thought, okay, now it's time to have the next step. It is time to give them the tools to get to know what is happening inside their heads, and not only me preparing the activities from a neuropsychological perspective as a teacher. And so we started as the first school in Argentina to implementing neuropsychoeducational classes in which children and teenagers of all ages can begin to understand what is happening inside their heads, what is going on with their emotional range, what is going on with their thoughts, mind, how is it that the brain works? How is it that they learn best? What is memory? What can I do to improve it? And so on and so forth. So 2 years ago, when FDCW asked me to prepare this course, The Wisdom of Neuroscience, I thought, okay, let's do the same thing for adults, for any person interested in knowing more about what is going on inside my head. What is this that I call feelings and emotions? And what is this that I call perspective, biases? How is all these thoughts that come and run around my head 24/7, how is it that they are formed? Is there a definition for mind? Is it true that we have a natural tendency for compassion, or it's just a cultural thing? So all these questions are integrated in the course in the hope of providing tools to better understand and navigate our daily lives with a better understanding of what is going on from a neuropsychological point of view, at least what science can tell us so far. So
that's
wonderful.
What
we are offering. Thank
you.
So
using neuroscience to better understand our minds, but not just for understanding, but to improve our lives and our emotional relationships and so on. So we want to hear a lot more about that. But before we do, Geshe, can you talk a little bit about how we learn about the mind through Buddhist study and meditation, and what your job is?
My job description. Yeah. I mean, similar to what Ceci is saying, that what's going on inside the head, right? What are emotions? What are thoughts? What is perception? What is memory? Already the Buddha 2,500 years ago asked those questions, and in those periods of time, there was no neuroscience, there was no empirical aspects of understanding the physical brain. So they had other kind of methodology, what we called, philosophy of mind, or psychology, or the epistemology and reasoning of mind and its emotions. So that started 2,500 years ago in the Buddhist context. And then the Buddha was mainly interested in the aspects of mind that disturb us, and how can I cause that process to stop, or how can I achieve more happiness? As we all beings have the same wish, wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. And then the Buddha was just, questioning what is actually the cause of all this. And then came to the conclusion that actually it's all rooted in the mind. Yeah? So we don't say it's between the ears, it's not all in the head, although there's the physical brain, which has a correlation with what we call consciousness. Yeah, so there is a correlation between the two. And maybe it will come up during our dialogue that there can be probably a two-way traffic. First brain activity, then consciousness, or first consciousness and then brain activity. So yeah, the Buddha was mainly interested in that aspect, and also that caused me to get some interest when I was in my early 20s, and that's why I started, a little bit generating more interest in understanding this aspect of psychology. What is mind? What are emotions? And what are destructive emotions? How they are caused? And how can I create a kind of conducive way of thinking to eliminate destructive emotions and produce kind of constructive ones? Yeah, so that's what I've been studying for about 20 years in South India. A little bit more than that, but as a summary. And then now here in the West, many courses are related also with destructive emotions, and we have secular and universal aspects. That's kind of how we divide Buddhism in general. Yeah, we can have secular universal aspects of psychology, mind science, and its philosophy. It's very universal. So you don't have to be a spiritual practitioner. You don't have to be a Buddhist or a believer. It's just science. Yeah, science and its philosophy. And then, of course, next to that, we have kind of for those who are interested, we also have the spiritual part. So we also conduct various courses here at Jamyang in both directions. Yeah, we have also projects in the universal or secular aspect, as well as for Buddhist practitioners, so to say. Yeah.
And so we wanted to go a little bit into how all of this helps practically, because sometimes gaining knowledge about something doesn't necessarily help you in a practical ways. It just increases knowledge. So for example, knowing that a thought, that the firing of a neuron might relate to a thought or a feeling, how does that benefit us? So of course, what you're doing, Ceci, is practical, and Geshe too, of course. Ceci, could you talk a little bit about how this neuroscientific understanding of our brain and minds practically helps people? And then we'll have Geshe talk a little bit about how Buddhism complements some of the ideas you bring up. Oh, we lost your sound. Oh, muted.
No, I had muted myself before. Sorry. Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. Well, this was one of the questions we had when preparing the course, because we didn't want to have just a course on neuroscience. There are hundreds of books written about the anatomy of the brain. You don't need anybody to tell you about the parts of the brain, the lobes, and all those difficult names and anatomical parts and functions in the human brain. We wanted to learn from that what we can take to our daily life, and understanding of daily activities, reactions, patterns, biases that we have. Where do they come from? Is there a biological reason for them? Is there a biological purpose for them? If so, what is it? And has it deviated within time? Has those original purposes, biological purposes, have they deviated through time in our modern societies? If so, our understanding of that can help us comprehend that many, many purposes and structures and functions that our brain and mind do are not there to be against us. For example, from a scientific point of view, we don't think there are destructive emotions, but emotions that, when taken to a daily life in a reactive way, they can produce destructive results. And this is, of course, the beauty of this dialogue, no? to gather information from different sides, to broaden our view of what is it that happens to all of us. If you come to think about it, there is a commonality in all this. We all have emotions. We all have them many, many, many times throughout the day. Actually, we are emotional beings who think rather than rational beings who feel occasionally, again, from a scientific point of view. So understanding this allows us to open up, to feel them, to welcome them, to try to understand that they are trying to give us a message, talking about emotions, for example. We also understand the difference between emotions and feelings, and emotions and sensations. They are all information, but they are coming from different sources. And so if we understand them, maybe we can gather, a wider source of information coming from the outside. And how is it that we are processing all that? Again, if we add to that, what is perspective? How is it that our perspective is molded? What is it that we can do to shift our perspective, to look at a problem from another angle, for example, to know that we all, just because we were born in the country that we were born, to the family that we were born, in the time that we were born, we have our biases that are different for all of us, for each of us. So understanding those things, we feel that can provide very useful tools to navigate, everyday waves with a deeper understanding. And also it can enhance our capacity for self-compassion, understanding ourselves, providing ourselves a little bit of tenderness, not being so harsh on ourselves sometimes.
Can you provide a specific example of how a neuroscientific understanding of emotion or bias helps us to better, I don't know if you'd say control or understand or regulate those emotions?
Yes. Okay. For example, with emotions, and for many, many years, before a group of scientists started meeting with His Holiness the Dalai Lama 40 years ago in Dharamsala, scientists were more interested in learning, because of psychology, learning about these so-called negative emotions. So learning about anger and learning about depression and learning about, all things that carry usually destructive reactions. But after those meetings, they started focusing more on learning about compassion, about bonding, about joy, about generosity. And we think that by understanding how is it that they function within the brain, and knowing that, for example, feeling an emotion, it's just a 1 second firing of a neuron, and that it is the story that we create after that that provokes that feeling growing stronger in the body and maybe perpetuating for days, if not months, if not years. And the tools that we can have to interrupt that flow of the ongoing story. And also understanding the information that emotion can provoke in the body, and so transforming into a feeling and sensations, we can catch them faster before we are completely taken for this by this emotion or feeling. So by trying to catch ourselves before that second of reaction, can of course relieve from consequences that maybe are not so beneficial to us. And talking about biases, nowadays science has investigated and understood that there are more than 15 types of biases that we have, and they have been proven that, for example, there is an 80% more probability that we choose to meet or to interact with a person that has our own physical characteristics than we would do with a person who doesn't. So knowing that and being aware of that can put us in the challenge of breaking that bias, or at least questioning it, challenging, stepping out of our comfort zone and say, hey, wait a minute, maybe it's not a coincidence that people who are sitting here have these physical characteristics, and what can I do to move from here and expose myself to something that is perhaps not so comfortable, but definitely more beneficial.
So one of the things you said is interesting, that the biological experience of emotion from a neuroscientific perspective is very brief, but then it's a kind of cognitive elaboration that then makes you ruminate or extend and deepen what might be just a brief type of response. Geshe, I think Buddhism might have something in parallel to this understanding of emotion and bias, if you'd like to share that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very similar, right? That what Ceci just discussed is kind of emotions can cause a kind of result, and with destructive emotions, a kind of destructive result, as we know with emotion like anger, for example. Yeah, so that is very common in all fields, I think, of psychology as well as neuroscience and Buddhist philosophy and psychology. And another aspect she just mentioned also is to understand the emotions, to welcome them, and to be aware of the feelings and emotions, and knowing this information, then know how to make a decision if you follow these emotions or not, right? So there are very many common grounds in order to navigate the waves of the different emotions as you just described. So maybe if you summarize it in a way with what we can describe how it actually practical is going to function, is that initially we have to build the kind of awareness, right? What we mostly call a kind of self-awareness. If you're not aware of emotions, then as Ceci just mentioned also, you just be taken over it by it, right? So if you're really aware of an emotion like anger or anxiety or fear or whatsoever that comes to mind, then the more you're aware about it, the more you recognize it. The more you recognize it, you're capable of actually taking a distance from an emotion. For example, if an emotion is quite fresh, then maybe it's better not to, to activate it too quick, but to wait a little bit, take a distance, and then think about it, right? So that has to do with a kind of self-awareness. So there's different techniques of breathing exercise that brings a kind of awareness. So the thing is that we have to get a distant kind of approach to the emotion, and then we can look at it from a much more neutral perspective and not getting involved, right? So that's the aspect of self-awareness. So when emotion like anger comes up, you just observe and see it coming, take distance, and then from a distance you can actually observe much better what's going on before engaging it. And so that aspect of being aware of the sensations and feeling is, the initial moment is very brief, as he also just indicated, but then we conceptualize it more and more, and the emotion takes over, and it becomes kind of an emotional hijack, right? So then it's too late, right? So then it's better to go for a walk and try to relax the mind and break that cycle of this particular pattern, of this particular emotion. And then you come back, and then you think about it later when the mind is a bit calmed, and then you analyze a little bit more. How did it come? How did it abide? How did it disintegrate, right? So in that way, we build this kind of self-awareness. The more you have built on this self-awareness, then there's a possibility to actually face these emotions and see what do they do. Are they beneficial or not? And that's true for positive emotions as well as negative emotions. So with negative emotions, you contemplate the faults of anger versus the benefits or the qualities of practicing patience, right? So then over time, the mind shifts in its kind of understanding of what's better for oneself. Yeah, and that helps us to actually what we call this kind of self-regulation, right? The next step after self-awareness is kind of self-regulation, regulating the emotions, being in control, so to say, by the power of, first of all, taking a distance approach and being neutral and accept emotions and see how they come, see if they were beneficial or harmful, and then applying antidotes like patience versus anger, for example, that we analyze the things in a kind of very, relaxed manner without getting involved, and then come to a conclusion and then focus on that conclusion. So that gives us insights in which emotions are more beneficial and which emotions are we rather don't like to face, right? So then it becomes actually a transformation process. Because our mind functions like that, right? When we get angry, within a few split seconds, we're capable of analyzing and come to a conclusion, this person is bad because of this, because of this, because of this. So that capacity of the mind to analyze, we use in a constructive way to analyze the faults of anger versus the qualities of practicing patience. Yeah? And that's by itself is a transformation process, or what we call this kind of regulation of the emotions. Yeah? If you're capable of doing this regulation, then also the step of self-compassion and compassion for others comes, right? So you know you don't want this emotion, and you know how you can deal with it, how you can actually apply an antidote and transform the mind, right? And then with that particular knowledge is a kind of a self-compassion, if you like to call it like that, because you help yourself in development. And then with that knowledge and understanding, then we try later on to help others. So then we come to the more kind of genuine, defined form of the positive emotion of compassion, so to say. Yeah.
I'm struck by the gentleness of both of your approaches, because it seems like you both say, accept these things as they come up in your mind, but don't over-identify with them, right? And then use some of your higher cognitive capacity to decide whether you want to follow them or whether you might even want to change. This process is a little difficult for even us adults who try to practice it. And my understanding, Ceci, is you're actually working with children and teenagers who, at least based on my experience of being one and having one, sometimes are the most extreme emotional swings. So how do these techniques work with children? How are you managing to apply them there? And for those of us who are parents, how can we help our kids?
Well, actually, there has been a lot of trial throughout the years and try to see which aspects would be the most beneficial for each age. Overall, we cannot think of any part of the process that is not beneficial. I mean, of course, some children, some teenagers will be more involved into these activities and classes, and of course they will gain more knowledge or understanding, but just by putting this discussion inside the classroom and saying, oh, did it happen to you? Oh, raise your hand if another person has ever got, furious. Oh, what happened during the break? There was a fight. Okay, instead of saying, you two, go to the tension, and that's it, and they will repeat that next week. Okay, we have to get a better understanding, and we need to provide that understanding in a way that is accessible even when they are 5, 6, 7, and even if they are 15, 16, 17, and they are in that age of, I know it all. So how can we approach them and provide them with tools that will, again, serve them throughout their whole life? So as Geshe said, this self-awareness, we call it recognition here in the school. So one of the first tools we do for children is 2 steps. Number 1, provide them with emotional alphabet. This thing that you are feeling is called anger, frustration, impatience, or joy, whatever it is. But there are over 300 words only in the English language to name emotions and feelings. And if we come to think about it, we only use a bunch of them every day. How are you doing? Fine. That's it. It's that everything that's it? So number 1, we pay a lot of attention to introducing more and more alphabetical emotional awareness, okay? And there are shades in the emotions. We are not always angry. We can be mildly irritated. We can be completely furious. We can be just annoyed. So shades. And then the recognition in their bodies. As soon as they can recognize and name, where are you feeling it right now? Are you feeling it in in your stomach? Are you feeling it in your throat? Are you feeling it in your fist because you really want to punch your partner? Where is it? So all these very early tools that we can provide them with, then will build up into this knowledge of what is happening inside of me. Why is it that react the way I do? Why is it that certain things make me angry and others don't? Why is it that, I feel left out? So we talk about the emotional world. Not only that, we talk about how the brain learns best. Why is it important to have fruits and vegetables in our diet? Not only because mommy says so, but because, and then we provide them with some data and say, okay, now, tomorrow you have a test? Okay, so I ask them, are you going to study tonight, very late tonight, or are you going to get up very early in the morning to study? What would be better for your memory process? And through discussions and many games and a lot of experiences, we start building up this knowledge on neuroscience, psychology, emotional world, a better understanding of themselves. We start when they are 3. Believe it or not, we start when they going to be the same information that we provide them. But for example, when the moment they are 3, we start with this body recognition of the feeling. Where is that sensation? Is it, is it big? Is it small? Is it punching? Is it? And then we ask them, does it have a temperature, for example? And what is the first thing that you would like to do? And then we come to ask, would be that the wiser thing to do? So we try to make a difference between the reaction, my tendency, and then, as Geshe said, okay, my choice. Okay, so you see how little by little this path is starting to build in since they are 3, and it begins with the alphabetical, emotional, practice of naming emotions, and also within an emotion, naming the different shades it may have.
And Geshe, what's the Buddhist perspective on working with children to understand and regulate their emotions?
You want to have a traditional Buddhist perspective or a personal one?
I mean, your choice. Personal sounds quite interesting.
I mean, generally speaking, Buddhism is quite, is quite a sophisticated system, which is not easy to put into practice. Even when His Holiness came for the first time to India and met Pandit Nehru, then Pandit Nehru made a comment: Buddhism is a very, very interesting way of life, but is one of the most difficult ones to put into practice. So this is probably true, because we have very strong habituations with emotions, and it's not easy to change the mind, right? So, but it's possible. And especially with children, as Ceci is just indicating, you have to do it a very playful way. Yeah. So once, just recently, I had to give a talk to Tibetan youth, and they were a bit older than 3 though, but they're in the category of, I think, 6 till 16, something like that. So then you have to be very playful in ask them the question: what is happiness? What disturbs the mind? And you have to give them a personal first-hand experience that they can relate to, rather than terminology of anger and its definition, right? So that is one aspect. And other aspects, I think, breathing or yoga kind of practices helps a lot, especially for very young children. Because if you talk about 6, 7, 8, 9 years, then you have to have something very practical and something they get first-hand experience, right? So if you do some yoga with them or some breathing exercise, they see, oh, I'm much calmer now, or I can concentrate much better in class, right? So we see that in different types of research of what has been done here in the UK with yoga in secondary schools, for example, right? So that means that it helps the children straight away get a first-hand experience of the mind, right? So they can see a distinction between when I'm very agitated, or when I get very uptight with my friends, or when I just at peace and do some breathing. And then they learn about the different kind of patterns in the mind. And then that's the first step of this, what we call then self-awareness or recognition, as Cecile indicates, right? So that's the first step. And then in a playful way, probably you just have to explain that, how does it feel, anger, right? So they have to get a first-hand experience, and then you can move a step further and say, okay, you see, it's not always present. It changes, it comes and goes, and then in a playful way, you have to learn, or they have to learn basically of this recognition of states of mind they like to acquire, like peace of mind, and the states of mind they don't like to be in, like these kind of destructive aspects of anxiety or fear or kind of forms of anger, for example. So yoga is not really part of Buddhist philosophy, as you know, but it's kind of a skillful means, right, to help beings to become more aware, or breathing exercises, and then walk with them in a very playful way.
One of the things that's encouraging about Buddhism starts with this not very catchy slogan that life is suffering, but then later on we find out but we can change, and that even that it's actually fundamental to ourselves that deep inside we have this kind of goodness and kindness, So is that changeability? I think that's a really optimistic part of Buddhism that you're talking about, Geshe. Ceci, what's the neuroscientific perspective on the changeability of the mind and whether the mind is, fundamentally good or not? There's this term neuroplasticity that's quite recent and quite optimistic.
Absolutely, and that is the key word in all these aspects of is it possible to change? And if we think that 30 years ago it was unthinkable by science that the brain and the mind could change, and say, oh, how discouraging was to lead such a life in which you get what you get, there's nothing you can do, you're stuck with who you are, the way you are, and there is no room for change. I cannot imagine how discouraging that must have been. But lucky for us, that has changed. And now it has been proven the tremendous power of adaptability called neuroplasticity, that both the anatomical brain and the mind, which, as you know, it's we all know, but by just personal experience, it's not something, an object, a physical object that we can grasp. They both have the possibility of changing. It's not always easy, as some marketing says, change in 21 days or create a habit in 21 days. It's not always as that, but there is this possibility of changing, both anatomically speaking and in the way it proceeds, it thinks, it reacts, in the way neurons connect and fire together. So what a great joy it is to know that and to understand this process. It is always easy? No, it is not. It is always as fast as we think it is? No, it is not. And we need to put an effort, and we need to put a lot of repetition, because we will be creating new neural pathways. We will be creating new regions in which neurons will fire together in a different way. And by creating new neuronal connections and decreasing the amount of times per day that we use the old path, little by little, we will start noticing a new tendency in the way we react, or the first thoughts that come to mind, or we will become more familiar with a certain pattern, and we will become less familiar to react in the way we did in the old pattern. So good news, it is very much possible. Not so good news, it's not always in 21 days, but we will keep with the good ones.
Yeah, just like Geshe is saying, it's difficult. And is there any, this is a difficult question, but is there any sense of, a morality from a neuroscientific perspective? Because from the Buddhist perspective, they do have this idea that there is some kind of fundamental goodness in it. And it feels good to be good also, like from a selfish perspective. But from the neuroscientific perspective, is there any value associated there with, being aggressive, being altruistic, or being neutral? Is that just our choice of which we'd like to do with our lives, or is there a direction from our biology?
Well, that's a very, very good question. And I think that is a very tricky point in which neuroscience and cultural backgrounds join. And so in different studies, will probably provide different answers. For example, Richard Davidson, this neuroscientist who has been working very close to His Holiness the Dalai Lama for over 3 decades, he has focused on studying compassion and the compassionate roots through evolution. Is it true that there is some part of the brain that is devoted to making us feel compassion for others? And he has devoted all his studies, and luckily for us, yes, there is. And we discuss this more in the course. So, and there are other studies that are more intertwined with psychological points of views, that studies the tendency to be competitive, and so in the tendency, of course, aggression will come up more usually than not, and also the tendency to feel depressed, and how a hormonal imbalance can cause all those illnesses. So depending on the school of choice, you will get to different understandings. But lucky for us, in the last 20, 30 years, new roads of investigation has been opened by excellent neuroscientists with the help and encouragement of His Holiness, which we appreciate so much. And neuroscientists have not only focused on the negative aspects of the mind, but how to cultivate and first understand and then cultivate the more positive ones, the ones that make us feel better with ourselves, and thus feeling us more altruistic, compassionate, generous towards others.
And Geshe, what's the Buddhist perspective, and also you know a lot about neuroscience as well. What's your perspective of, what's fundamental and deep and with morality, and whether goodness is deeper than our negative emotions?
I mean, from a Buddhist perspective, it's quite clear. All the teachings of the Buddha, they talk about our mental attitudes motivates our physical and verbal behaviors. And it depends on how we feel or how we act in a mental way, actually produces a particular, physical verbal act. And we see that in many fields, that people who have disturbed mind, they can create causes of problems in society. Yeah, for example, one of my friends who translate for a project in the prison, in Central Prison in Bangalore, he is there for murder, but he is a very, very nice person. He's a very nice person to be with, and he does a lot of good social things for the inmates. And he translated in the local language, he talks the local language, he knows how to talk with the people. So when you meet with him, you think, oh, very nice chap, right? But he committed an act of murder. So he told me once, he said, for 10, 15 minutes, I was not in control. I made a mistake. So that proves that our mental attitudes actually creates reaction in the physical world. But it's possible to train your mind. As we all know, in Buddhism, we talk about these kind of innate aspects of compassion, love and kindness, wisdom, which are innate in the sense that if they were not a part of us, we would never be able to develop it, right? If we never have those potential, we're never able to develop it. So it's possible to develop that, right? So that's the kind of an innate potential we all have, humans, animals, same thing. It's very interesting recent research being done with regards with gorillas and bonobos, right? That the evolution theory of Darwin can have many interpretations. And what they found in the studies of studying the bonobos is kind of similar to the gorilla, but not as aggressive. They actually are much more harmonious and much better in surviving aspects. And that they came down to the conclusion because the males are not as aggressive as the gorillas, right? Gorillas, they sometimes actually kill gorillas from the other group. Well, the bonobos are very, very compassionate. So there's a very interesting research and there's more like different types of research that not only human beings, but even in the animal realm, we see this kind of aspect of these potentials that can be developed. Yeah, so in Buddhism, then, of course, we try to draw on that potential and try to use methods or methodologies that helps us to develop those innate kind of potentials. And if by doing so, then the person changes, right? And that has to do then with this neuroplasticity, as you can call it, that train your mind, train your brain, as we call it. That, as I said, there is consciousness, and what consciousness is all about from a neuroscientific point of view is still quite a question. But the brain, we know to a certain extent. So, and we know how, if you train consciousness in the same research, different types of research by, Richard Davidson and others, that meditators who contemplated these potentials of the mind, this positive aspect of the mind over, let's say, 15,000 till 15,000 hours, they produce gamma waves never measured before in the human brain. So that means that there are potentials within our consciousness that actually, if you activate them, right, you can develop them to an extent that you can measure things in the brain that produces incredible positive aspects that was never measured before. So that means we have the potential, but it's a matter of fact of to develop, right? So yeah, that's another potential because we can develop. It's not only we have those potentials, but because the mind is momentarily changing, and the mind depends on many causes and conditions to move into a particular direction. So with certain kind of mental trainings, as we see in these types of research, with this, what we call the Olympic meditators, so to say, that they produce kind of states of consciousness, according to neuroscience, which is never really measured before, and very positive and constructive form of consciousness. So that is just the activation of these inner potentials, so to say. Yeah.
Yeah. And if I may add,
Please,
reading about those scientific interventions and studies to those Olympic meditators, it has been found, and well, to me it's fascinating, so I would like to share it with you if I can have only a minute, that after very long hours, of course, of training, certain areas, apart from the gamma waves that had been trained, certain areas had thickened parts of the cortex of their brains, and maybe it was 1 or 2 millimeters thicker than mine. But if you come to think that if their cortical areas are 1 millimeter thicker, and in that millimeter they can have probably 3 trillion more neurons with their neuronal connections that I do, you come to think about how a minimal in the physical realm, a minimal change can produce a lot of benefit in the way they will not only react, but the thoughts that they will be and the quality of life that will lead them to. So not only gamma waves, but only anatomical change by the millimeter.
This might be a nice time to open up to questions. We have another 15 minutes, and I even have one here that somebody just wanted to ask. Pete, would you like to ask a question? Or should I ask it for you? He sent it on the chat.
Yeah, so. Hello. So I had the good fortune to sit through the Wisdom of Neuroscience course. So I'm very familiar with Ceci. I live it in the London Monastery, so I'm equally familiar with talks from Geshe Namdak. So 2 of my favorite people, and I am just dying to hear you two talk about the biggest difference between you. Where is the mind? Is it coming from the brain, or is it coming from a previous point of a previous moment of mind? So I'd like you to talk a little bit, what is mind from the 2 perspectives?
I thought you liked us, Pete. I thought you liked us.
So would you like to have at that question? Where is the mind? So Pete said, where is the mind? Is the mind caused by a previous moment of mind, which I think is more the Buddhist perspective, or is the mind generated by the brain, or is it something else? Which of you would like to start that question? Where is the mind?
Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah, so mind is not physical, it's not matter. Also, in certain types of research in the near-death experience, for example, they call it non-local consciousness, which is a very nice term. And that completely is agreeable with the Buddhist perspective, because consciousness is not local, it's not matter. The definition of mind is clear and knowing, which means that it's a kind of entity that has the capacity that things can appear to it, and it can know those appearances, right? It can have a perception. So that is consciousness. But as we human beings, we have a physical brain, and consciousness depends on the brain, right? So there's a correlation, especially when you talk about sensory perception. It's very clear, the correlation between certain aspects or locations within the brain and sensory perception. That's very well researched, right? But when it comes to mental consciousness, as we know in Buddhism, we talk about 6 types of consciousness, 5 sensory perceptions and 1 mental consciousness. So this mental consciousness, to a certain extent, depends on the brain. It depends on the training of the individual. So to take, for example, obsessive compulsive disorder disease an example as base for explanation, then Jeffrey Schwartz did a very interesting research. That means that an untrained mind, the patient, so to say, is forced to act in a particular way because the neurotransmitters tells this person what to do. So that means that is first brain activity, and that is generated in consciousness, in intention and activity, right? Then if you train your mind with what he calls mental attention or the power of mental force, as we in Buddhism, we define those aspects as the mental factors, alertness and mindfulness, or introspection and mindfulness, right? So if you train your mind in those two mental factors, as we just discussed, you become more aware of what's going on inside your mind, and you be capable of not following certain thought patterns, right? So if you trained well in those stages, then there's first consciousness and then brain activity, because we talked about this neuroplasticity, that the mind training actually rewires the brain or changes the brain. So in that kind of mind training, you rewire the brain. If you rewire the brain, then the brain cannot tell you again to do these things as the mind or the brain was planning to tell you before, because you have rewired the whole issue. Yeah. To take an example, a very interesting kind of aspect here is Leonardo DiCaprio, one of the famous actors, when he plays the movie The Aviator. Yeah? Aviator. Aviator. Yeah. So in that movie, it's very interesting. He didn't have an OCD problem before shooting the film. He had to act as an OCD patient over a few months. Because of his habituation pattern, his mental intention, he rewired the brain in a way to get OCD, right? So you see there's first consciousness, then brain activity. Then after the shooting, he had a severe OCD problem. So the brain was rewired, so he acted in the way that the brain tells him to act. So then that means first he had during the shooting, consciousness. Oh, now I have to do this, now I have to do this. He rewired the brain, got OCD problem. Then in a period the brain told him what to do, he was not in control. Then he went to Jeffrey Schwartz, who helped him to train the mind and rewire the brain again. So you see that first was consciousness, which caused a kind of brain activity. Then brain activity causes a particular consciousness to come about. And then later on, it was reversed. So that means that there's a correlation between mind and the physical brain. And that's pretty clear in different types of research, right? Yeah. But when you talk about more subtle forms of consciousness, especially in the near-death experience, or as we call it, the clear light mind meditations of Thukdam, then there's less dependence or even no dependence on the physical brain. But still, there's a consciousness that has perception. And even there's a lot of evidence that suggests that the perception is valid at that time. So there's very interesting fields of how consciousness influences the brain and the other way around. And there are moments of consciousness without actually the need of research shows no detectable kind of activity in the brain in these clear light meditations. Yeah, or the EEG goes flat in a near-death experience. When the person comes back to life, what a person has perceived in that particular period can be validated, right? So, so that's very interesting fields between what we call consciousness and the physical brain.
And if I may add just one thing to what Geshe has said about the importance of correlation, and also from a neuroscientist point of view, there is still not a complete understanding of how the brain and the mind work all together. There is not a theory of the mind. What is that the understanding of different parts, different functions, the correlation between them, but there is still not one theory of the mind. So there is a long way to go still. That on the one side. And to add to what Geshe says about the correlation that we cannot deny about the mind and the brain, and that very common phrase that we use the mind to change the brain to change the mind, as he was saying in the example of Leonardo DiCaprio. In the last couple of years, there are other elements being added to the equation of brain and mind, such as body. And in the last 3 years, psychologists have started to also analyze the possibility of including the environment to the question of what is mind? Is it the working together of the brain activity together with the information coming from the body? And if we come to think about this, this late news of the second brain in the guts and the vagus nerve having the very important job of communicating it comes to sense, and also opening up to the idea of including the environment, because there is, as it is in the brain and the mind, a very close correlation. There is another one with the body and also with the environment in which we are in. So I think it's a very interesting field still to be to be investigated for long.
We could talk about that question for a really long time. let's go to Victoria. You have a question?
Yes, I do. We hear a lot nowadays about trauma. I'd like to ask Geshe and Ceci about where trauma comes from, how we respond to it within ourselves and when we see it in others.
I mean, so trauma is kind of a habituation to a particular pattern of the mind that faces a kind of difficulty in life, right? So if you face a difficulty in life we find difficult to deal with, then we think about that particular event quite often, right? And we think about that event quite often also in a negative way. And that propels itself in a habituation pattern that even when you don't think about later on, it gets activated by the smallest kind of stimulation. So trauma is by itself probably just kind of an experience you don't like, and then you habituate your mind to that particular experience over a long period of time. And then that causes to trigger the mind whenever there's a kind of correlation with that particular trauma, and cause you to be negative, or cause you to be depressed, or cause you to be lonely or down or whatsoever. So it's probably related with this kind of pattern that has been built up over some time based on a kind of very intense negative event, right? So that's, generally speaking, probably what trauma is all about. But then how you deal with that, there's of course different interpretations, right? So yeah, I don't know if maybe you do that later. Yeah.
Well, yes, and of course it's undoubtedly at the moment of the experience, it's almost a defense mechanism. The brain gets fixated in what has happened and all the elements around that situation, so as to be more prepared next time, in order even to escape, to freeze, to survive in any way it is possible. Nowadays, what is interesting about trauma is that it's being understood both from a neurological perspective, what neurotransmitters are involved when the event happens, and what neurotransmitters are then released each time we feel triggered or the person feels triggered with that original trauma. But more interestingly, now in the field, when working with children, it is being seen that many times children don't get hurt because of the event, but, and I guess it can be also applied to adults, but they get hurt because of the loneliness in which they have lived the event, not only during the event, but afterwards. So we are going back to the very essential field of connection. So nowadays, trauma is being, on the table so much more often than before, but I think it's not only a matter of neurologically speaking, what is happening in which area of the brain, but what is lacking for that negative event to get fixated in the brain and then producing those triggering effects years, even decades after. So again, very interesting field to be further investigated. Thank you for the question.
Hey, Geshe, did you want to follow up briefly with the second part? I bet a few people would like to hear how you deal with trauma.
I mean, one particular aspect probably is in a similar structure, that you probably first have to get a kind of acceptance to a certain extent, right? And take distance from the event. And then you have a possibility to observe it from a neutral perspective, and you can much better deal with it than being involved in it again yourself. So that these kind of thought patterns don't take over, right? So that's probably one important aspect of recognition. And probably it helps to talk with other people who have similar experience to open up, because what happens, you think about this negative event, very, very often, and you're lonely by yourself, so you cannot express it, and it makes this habituation pattern only stronger and stronger and stronger, and that will repeat itself. Yeah. So one aspect is the acknowledgement and the openness about it probably is very, very essential in the first step of dealing with it, right? And then you have to think about certain aspects of coming and going of the mind and coming and going of events in life. And, you know, that life has to go on, and just thinking about aspects again and again is not really going to solve the problem, so to say, right? So there are probably a lot of different methodologies to understand that it's a coming and going aspect. Life is not perfect, as we in the Buddhist doctrine, as you said, yeah, we often talk about suffering and death and impermanence, but it's a way to face the problem, right? So that's the first step, the way to face the problem, and then look for a constructive way how to solve the problem. So then with trauma, first acceptance should be there, and then you should analyze, talk with other people, and try to see that it's an event that happens not only to you, because there's more people like that, right? And then then it's a possibility to open up, and then it's a possibility to forgive yourself or forgive others. Of course, judgment should be there if there's misbehavior that should be corrected. But if corrected, then we have the mental issues to deal with, right? So with the mental issues to deal with, also then there should be a kind of acceptance and forgiveness in order to go to the next step, right? So that seems to be also quite important. We all make mistakes, and also that we should understand that is true in all of us, right? So that might help in the case of moving forwards. Yeah? So in Tibetan kind of occupied Tibet, for example, people tortured in prison. It's very interesting to see that the majority, of course, a few cases are there, but the majority of people who are actually tortured for years at a time, most of them, they don't show this post-traumatic stress disorder, which is very, very interesting. So that means that if you have an event in life, of course, judgments should be there. You have to take the measurements that should be taken to stop these activities from happening again. But when we talk about our mental aspects of dealing with it, then it's a different kind of direction of acceptance and forgiveness and moving forward, and then become a more positive, talk with others about it, and then there's a possibility to go a step further, and then you can produce kind of states of mind that slowly you lose this kind of habituation pattern of thinking about it again and again in a negative way. You move out of that because of your acceptance and because of your openness, and think about in a more constructive way moving forward with forgiveness for yourself and others. So that, yeah, and it's been proven in these cases that it seems to work in people in these kind of very difficult situations without post-traumatic stress disorder. That's very, very interesting. And they use similar mind training of forgiveness. If you're in a situation you cannot do anything about it, then you have to deal with it mentally, right? So that's kind of the aspects of mind training that comes then into the picture of acceptance and forgiveness, probably can help quite a lot. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question from Saida and Marco.
Hi. First of all, I want to thank Geshe, Ceci, and Scott for the great dialogue, and also all the friends from the FDCW. Thank you very much. I have a question about, again, the nature of consciousness and the brain, because it seems from a Buddhist perspective, a lot of our suffering is because there is something which is superimposed over the essential nature of consciousness, which is clear and without suffering and with great compassion for all beings. And on the other hand, looking at the brain of these very experienced, accomplished meditators, you can actually see that the brain is more developed. There is thicker cortex, more neurons, more neural connections. So does it actually take some more complex brain to have a simpler mind? Was the relation between getting closer to the essential nature of consciousness, but actually having a more complex brain as a basis for it?
Geshe, this is your field.
Oh yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it's okay. I mean, if you develop the mind, I don't know. I'm not a neuroscientist, and I don't know how many millimeters your brain will grow if you go into retreat for a few decades. But you know, it's kind of from a Buddhist perspective, we don't have an answer to this, right? Because we don't know, we don't study neuroscience as such. But another aspect you can talk about, that certain types of consciousness that is free of afflictions, the innate kind of clear-light mind, so to say, yeah, that if you meditate on that and you activate that, then there's probably less brain activity because it's less kind of correlated with the brain. And that proves, that's been proven in near-death experiences and this kind of Tudam or clear-light mind of death meditations, where the meditator is very controlled over the death process, right? Well, according to recent research that's been published in January, that there is no detectable activity in the brain measured at that particular time. In a similar way, in a near-death experience, we have a similar state of mind, according to the Buddhist interpretation of Haisha Tantra. In that state of a near-death experience, then the person has a very subtle state of mind, almost going to the next life. But when the person is revived, the person comes back to life. So the moment, and that's a very, from a scientific point of view, it's a very controlled environment, right? They have an EEG running. They know the person is, you know, mostly it happens in cardiac arrests, right? So within 10, 20 seconds, oxygen flow to the brain stops, the brain dies, right? We can measure that. But there are cases of people who have perception in that particular period before just coming back when there's no brain activity. And this perception, what they experience or what they see, that can be validated if they come back, right? If they don't come back, then it's a bit difficult to validate. But if they come back to life, and that's been well documented in different types of research, Pim van Lommel, for example, Sampraneda, for example, you know, there's a lot of very, very well documented research that actually comes to figures 60 to 80%, or some research to 90% even, of what people perceive during a near-death experience is valid, is not just mere illusion. Yeah, that it goes to examples of knowing exactly what the surgeon was doing at that particular time, and which was validated later on. So it's very interesting matter. So at that time, there's no, I don't know if the brain grows at that time or not, but it doesn't look like, because there's no actually physical measurement of brain activity, right? But how it works with our kind of waking consciousness and how we, you know, meditate on the stages of certain aspects of the training, then we probably have to rely on the research of Richard Davidson and others to see what actually happens in the physical brain, right? Yeah.
So these subtle states of mind are the cause for brain growth and development rather than the other way around, according to a Buddhist point of view.
I mean, growing of the brain, I don't know, but an increase of neurotransmit or neuroconnections, probably, that's probably true, right? That because if you train your mind, we train the brain, as we say, but it's true, right? If you train your mind, you're much more capable of being more aware about your own emotions. You're more aware about the emotions of others. So that, of course, has an influence on brain structure. Yeah. So what kind of influence that is, that you have to ask the neuroscientists. And another aspect is, you know, different states of mind trigger different areas in the brain, as we know, right? So that would be very interesting research, how certain kind of constructive ways of thinking, you know, actually influence these kind of different areas in the brain, and what actually happens, where are these neurotransmitters or these correlations or more pathways or more neural connections being built? Yeah, and I mean, there's already quite some research been done, but it would be even more interesting to see different levels of consciousness, right? We talk about the near-death experience, we talk about the Tudam, and we only have a few cases up till now documented, right? But that it would be a very interesting field, because we're talking about a consciousness without brain activity that is aware, right? So that field would be very, very interesting. Yeah.
Ceci, anything to add before we wrap up? Maybe we could talk about this for a very long time.
That's it. We can talk about this for a really, really long time. I think that if we can keep ourselves with this idea that working with the mind can have the capacity to change the brain, to change the mind for the better, I think that it's a very good outcome out of all this conversation. And of course, it would be lovely to repeat the experience and go forward with these discussions.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Lai. I really enjoyed being a small part of this discussion, and I'll turn it back over to Victoria to say goodbye.
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you to our speakers and to our moderator today. Thank you for sharing your clarity and your wisdom, your insights. Really appreciate that. I've really enjoyed it. I'd love to squeeze in some more questions, but we're out of time. So please do join us for a series of workshops and talks that the Foundation is having during our Compassion, Wisdom and Action conference, which runs from the 15th to the 20th of November. You can get full details on our website, compassionandwisdom.org, and it's completely free. So thank you from me, and let's hope we can do this again. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.